Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. I feel honored to be invited back to Canada to talk about agricultural trade. I want to thank John Cranfield for inviting me, and also recognize Rick Barrichello and Al Mussel, who I've discussed this paper with. They're not implicated, but they certainly helped me think through some of these points. So the topic is emerging markets, ag trade, and Canada's relative performance. It's hard for me to see these slides too, so I'll do my best. When John sent me an email, the question he posed is the first line in this slide: how will rising economic opportunity in emerging markets drive Canada's agricultural trade? It's a good question. So the first thing you have to do is define emerging markets. And there are different definitions of emerging markets, so I'm sticking with the IMF definition. Most of these emerging markets are in Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. So there's really, I guess, three key points in my paper. The first is that these markets are expected to grow at probably double the rate of the advanced countries for at least the next 5 years. So there's very strong growth in this part of the world. That's why John asked the question, I think. Given the economic growth in this part of the world, this will lead a shift in global food demand and agricultural trade towards higher valued, higher processed products, things like meats, beverages, dairy, pasta, processed vegetables, and so on. That's where we expect to go over the next 10 to 20 years. And I think some of the evidence I present supports that, and so we're sort of left with the question, is Canadian agriculture well positioned for the new dynamics in the international market? And unfortunately, my conclusion is no. So the table on this first slide, I think, indicates why everyone's interested in China and India, two of the powerhouses when it comes to emerging markets. Over the past 6 years, 37% of global economic growth has originated in China. If we take China and India together, that's 50% of global economic growth. So if one of those engines goes out, we lose 37% of our thrust. If two of those engines go out, we lose 50% of our thrust. That's why what's happening in India, whether their economy is expected to grow 5% this year, whether China's is expected to grow 8%, is extremely important, not only for the global economy, but for agricultural trade. So in addition to China and India, there's a lot of discussion of the BRIC countries, and the BRICS have now become the BRICS, it's harder to say, including Indonesia and South Africa, in addition to China, Brazil, Russia, and India. Other important emerging markets are Mexico, Vietnam, Turkey, and Argentina. There's a long list of emerging markets, but those are the important ones. So this graph shows the rate of GDP growth in the advanced part of the world. That's the lower blue line. And we've just been through the financial crisis and negative economic growth. The green is the world average in the middle, and the top is growth in the emerging markets. And you see since 2000, growth in the emerging markets has averaged 6.2% versus 1.8% in the advanced. The reason world economic growth has been kept aloft is because of the emerging markets. And if you look at where that red line peaked back in 2006, 2007, greater than 8% growth in the emerging countries. This preceded the commodity boom, which affected all agricultural markets. So economic growth in this part of the world is extremely important for global agriculture. Now, if we adjust those growth rates for population, we have per capita GDP, and that's what I show on this slide. So this includes the BRICS. Russia is on top of the highest per capita income, but sort of slow growth. They went through a period of negative growth. So Russia's per capita income has only increased 1.2 times since 1990. And you see down below we have China, India, and Indonesia. Lower per capita income, but stronger growth. China's income has increased 6.7 times since 1990 and currently stands at $5,300 per capita compared to India's, which is $2,300. So China, India, Indonesia are not only growing faster than the other BRIC countries, but if you make a list of countries in terms of population, well, China's number 1, India's number 2, Indonesia's number 4. So this is what's driving changes in food consumption, is rapid economic growth in those countries. So what I said about trying to answer John's question, looking at the literature, I really base my analysis on the papers listed here. There's a paper out of USDA in 2005 by Anita Regmi, who classified agricultural trade into different categories, so I follow her approach. Peter Liapis from OECD sort of built on this, and he has a paper published in 2011 where he looks at agricultural trade according to the categories defined by the USDA. And he finds that ag imports by emerging markets are growing quite rapidly, and especially for what he calls processed agricultural commodities. So that's what I'm going to focus on during my talk is, these emerging markets and processed agricultural commodities. Hack and Melky have argued that China and Russia are significant ag food import growth markets in the future. And something that's relevant towards the end of my talk, Rick Barrichello and Danielle Goldfarb have talked about Canadian policy, in particular supply management and a WTO ruling in 1999, that sort of put a halt on dairy exports. And they point out that this cost the Canadian industry. They were right. They weren't saying it was an unfair ruling. What they were saying is it revealed a flaw in the Canadian system. This slide shows notable emerging ag importers. You see that China in 2011 imported $145 billion worth of agricultural products, 6 times what India imported, 5 times what Mexico imported. So that's why these countries are important in terms of global agriculture. Now, if we look at these processed goods, the PACs, this slide shows the exporters. So the top exporters would be the European Union, excluding intra-EU trade, the United States, Brazil. We see Canada on average over the 2009-11 period, exported $12 billion worth of processed agricultural commodities, which accounted for about 4.4% of global exports of processed ag commodities. Is that a high number for a country like Canada? Probably not, given the resource base in Canada, and given the fact that Canada is next door to the 3rd largest agricultural importer in the world. So we have a market across the fence, extensive resources, and I would say a relatively low share of exports of processed agricultural commodities. If you just compare Canada to New Zealand has a larger market share of 4.7% versus 4.4%. And when you look at the resource base, Canada has something like 30 times the arable land that New Zealand has, but New Zealand's outperforming Canada in this part of global ag trade. So here's a slide that gives you a little more detail on Canada. Canada's exports of processed agricultural commodities are pretty much destined for the United States, 71%, Japan, and these three countries, USA, Japan, and Russia, account for 80% of Canadian exports of processed agricultural commodities. So not really targeted at the emerging markets. Now, Doug Headley showed a slide yesterday, which I thought was very startling. He showed us that Canada's trade balance for processed ag commodities is worsening and is around $6 billion. That's supported by these numbers, a relatively low market share. But in terms of what products Canada is exporting in the processed area, well, it would be meats, prepared vegetables. You see over on the right-hand side, we have some processed grains, beverages, and so on. Those shares are relatively small for processed grains and flour preparations, probably due to our grains policy in Canada, which really discouraged processing in the country. This graph shows exports of processed ag commodities to emerging markets. And you'll see on top is the United States, which is flying high, exports of $23.4 billion. So the trajectory with the United States, New Zealand is the second from the top, the green one. You can see that trajectory is up. The Canadian trajectory, which is the bottom, is, I guess you would describe that as low and slow. 1.6 billion, so it's only about 11% of Canadian exports of processed ag commodities goes to emerging markets. So what is Canada's relative trade performance? Well, if you look at total agricultural trade, not just the processed goods, Canada's exports lag behind growth in world trade, partly due to its focus on bulk commodities, which happens to be the slowest growing the slowest growing category. Bulk commodities, that's where we're focused, so we have slower growth. Since 1990, world ag trade has increased tenfold. Canadian exports have increased about fourfold. Canada's supply managed sectors have focused on a relatively small domestic market, 35 million people, and sort of foregoing the world market. That's another reason. These last two lines I find quite interesting. Let me try to describe what I'm saying here. The third bullet says world pack exports to the world is 45%. So in other words, 45% of global agricultural trade is in the pack category, the processed category. So 45% is processed. 36% of the exports going to the emerging markets is processed. Okay? So almost half global ag trade is processed, and a very large share of exports to emerging markets is processed, more than 1/3. Now, if you look at Canada, which is the last line, it says 33% of Canadian exports is processed, so it's lower, and 11% of Canadian exports to emerging markets is processed. So Canada is less focused on processed goods than other ag exporters, and it's less focused on emerging markets when it comes to processed goods, and it so happens that the growth is occurring in emerging markets and in processed goods. Okay. I want to focus a little bit on animal products. That seems to be where the interesting growth is, and it accounts for a relatively large share of that group of pack products I talked about. So let's turn to the animal products for a second. So two respected agencies, USDA and OECD, provide trade forecasts for these products. We all know what the drivers are: population growth, income growth, urbanization. According to these agencies, and I have no reason to disagree, global demand for poultry is going to remain very strong and is expected to expand by about 30% to 2021. And the same with dairy, roughly same order of magnitude. This graph is from the OECD, and it's a little bit difficult to use this pointer because I don't have two pointers, and my eyes are sort of just looking one way. But anyway, this is the outlook for consumption growth. And there's sort of three peaks here. The one towards the left is poultry, consumption growth, 35%, and the grayish bar, that indicates developing countries. So strong consumption growth of poultry in developing countries. Those other peaks are for butter and skim milk powder. So poultry is the king. Here's another OECD slide that shows meat production. Okay, so the previous slide was consumption. This shows meat production. And the lighter blue over on the left is production in the developing countries, and the darker blue on the right is production in the developed countries. And you see it's beef, pork, poultry, and sheep. So over on the left-hand side, the lighter blue, those bars are larger than the darker blue. So roughly 77%, or 3/4 of meat production growth is expected to occur in developing countries to 2021. 3/4 of the production of meat growth in production will take place in developing countries. A large share of that will be poultry. That's the larger blue, light blue bar on the left, 47%. In a developed part of the world, you're seeing growth in each of those meat categories as well, and the same is true, that poultry is king. When you look at the darker bars, the one near the right-hand side shows 6.84 million metric tons growth in poultry. So poultry is expected to dominate growth. And that makes sense, just given the feed efficiency and so on. So if we turn those numbers into meat trade forecasts to 2021, we get this type of graph. And not surprisingly, poultry's on top, growing from 8.3 million tons in 2006 to 13.6 million tons in 2021. If you take the growth in poultry over this period, which is the green line on top, compared to the expected growth in beef and pork, which is on the bottom, the total projected increase in trade for poultry of 5.3 exceeds the sum of the increase for beef and pork, which is 3.4. So poultry dominates in production, growth, and trade growth projections. This graph shows Canadian versus U.S. poultry exports. And if you look really hard, there's some blue bars on the bottom, and that would be Canada. The red bar are the United States, and so you can see that, the U.S. altimeter is spinning, they're expanding poultry exports, and the Canadian altimeter just hasn't moved. So, when you look at this and you think about supply management, it's sort of like owning a Lamborghini, having it in your garage, but just driving around the neighborhood, never really taking it out on the open road. There's some enjoyment from driving around the neighborhood, and there's welfare from that, but you're missing out a lot if you don't take that car out on the open road. This is projected poultry net exports to 2021, and you see Brazil up on top is expected to have strong growth in poultry exports. The red line is the United States, and if you look really close at the bottom, there's a blue line, and that would be Canada. So this is projections, right? 2010 to 2021. If I showed this graph to my undergraduate class in commodity markets, and if I took the word poultry off and I just said, here's a market for widgets, the market's going to grow by 30% over the next 10 years. right? And there's two business plans, the one on top and the one on the bottom. Which do you think the students would choose? Are we going to flatline it like the business plan on the bottom, or are we going to participate in the market like the business plan on top? Here's historic milk production. The U.S. is on top, 36% growth over this time period. New Zealand in the middle, growth rate of 155%. Canada's on bottom, again, flatlining milk production. This is Canada versus U.S. non-fat milk powder production. Similar story. Big increase in the United States, 1.4 times since 1990. Nothing for Canada. I like this graph. It shows Canada versus U.S. dairy exports to emerging markets. Okay. Now, Mike Gifford asked an interesting question. He sort of made a statement yesterday. Does New Zealand really give a damn about Canadian supply management? And I think if I was a Kiwi and I looked at this graph, I'd say, no, I don't give a damn. It's fine if you stay out of the world markets. We're better off. So what this graph shows are exports to emerging markets, the red bars being the United States, the blue bars being Canada. And then on the top portion, we have these dashed lines, and that's the U.S. share to emerging markets. The red line and the blue dashed line is the Canadian share to emerging markets. So what do you notice different between the red dashed line and the blue dashed line? Well, one is trending up and one is trending down. That decision by the WTO in 1999 was around the time that blue line started moving down. And so it's trending down. The share of Canadian dairy exports going to emerging markets is, less than 40%. And the share for Canada is, for the U.S. is greater than 70. Canada less than 40. And I think New Zealand's just okay with the Canadian program. So when you think about this as an economist from a conceptual point of view, you have to ask the question, the one I ask my students, if you flatline it, are you leaving money on the table, right? So one way to think about this is to draw a demand curve over on the left. That's the Canadian demand curve. Small country, 35 million people, right? And then we have a world demand, which is the flat green line. And, there's billions of consumers in these emerging markets. So you could think of this as, say, the market for poultry products. Now, when you look at the literature on the economics literature on supply management, it pretty much focuses on the, what we call a deadweight loss over there off of the Canadian demand curve by restricting supply. But I think it's time we start focusing on the trade considerations. And the way I look at this is, once again, you have two alternative business plans. One, you can try to exploit that little demand curve over on the left and drive the price up from the green line, which I call PW, you can't read it, up to what I call PD, and that shows that red box, right? So you could try that approach and generate some economic rent. But in doing so, you give up the world market, right? That's what the WTO said. You essentially give up the world market. Alternatively, you could try business plan number 2 and sell into the world market where your supply curve would meet the green line and you'd be producing further out, shown by that blue area. So the bottom line is that the Canadian industry gives up the blue area in order to capture the red area. The trade-off. Now, we've done some preliminary work actually on this, and I think maybe the industry is leaving money on the table. The size of those areas is going to depend on the price and autarky, that PA down there. and on the supply elasticity. That's really key in terms of determining these areas. And especially when you think about going forward, because going forward, what's going to happen? That green line is going to move up. That's the world price. So as the world price moves up because of the expanded trade, they're going to be leaving more and more money on the table. Okay, conclusions. BRICS are important, BRICS are important, emerging markets are important, a lot of consumers, a lot of dynamics there with the type of growth we're seeing. Canada's export performance in processed agriculture products to emerging markets is virtually stagnant. That's the best I could come up with. So in my view, I grew up in Canada. I think Canada does have a comparative advantage in industrial animal agriculture. I think if anybody does, Canada does. So despite an apparent comparative advantage in industrial animal agriculture, I haven't measured this, but I'll state that I think it exists. Canada is not positioned to expand its exports of poultry and dairy. Domestic policy is holding back Canadian ag export performance. So when I go back to John's email that he sent me several months ago, he asked about constraints and opportunities. The opportunities are there, and the constraints are right in front of us. Thank you.